The murderer who wrote my obituary. The morning fog clung to the city like a damp shroud, curling around rooftops and dimming the gas lamps that still flickered weakly against the encroaching light of dawn. My shoes made a soft thud against the stone steps as I bent to retrieve the day's newspaper, rolled tight and slick with moisture. There was nothing remarkable in the act, nothing that should have set the pulse racing. Yet the moment I unfurled that paper, my breath froze in my chest. Across the front page, beneath the masthead, was a headline that cut sharper than any blade. Local journalist found dead in shocking murder. Below it was a grainy photograph I knew too well. My own face stared back at me from the black and white print, fixed in a half-smile I had worn at some long-ago press conference. The article beneath described the brutal slaying of Jonathan Hale, my name, my age, my profession, even details of where I lived. It was a perfect obituary except for one glaring fact. I was standing there alive, the paper clenched in trembling hands. For a long moment, the silence of Baker Street was so absolute I thought the world had ended. Only the foghorn from the river reminded me time was still moving. My heart, however, was locked in the paralysis of disbelief. I read the lines again and again, searching for error, some misprint, some grotesque coincidence of names. But the description left no room for doubt. The obituary was mine. I stumbled inside, the damp paper crumpling under my grip. The air of my flat felt suddenly oppressive, the familiar walls now conspirators to something unspeakable. Who had written this? How had it made its way into print before my death? Was it a cruel prank, or had I been marked for an end already planned? The article gave no hint of authorship beyond the initials of a staff writer I did not recognize. The account was chillingly precise, describing the discovery of my body slumped across my desk, a single bullet wound to the temple, the revolver still resting in my hand. Suicide, it speculated, though foul play could not be ruled out. Every word carved itself into my mind as though fate had already written the final act. I tried to convince myself it was nothing but a macabre hoax. Yet the detail was too intimate, the knowledge too exact. My private study, the make of my revolver, even the stack of notes I had been working on, they were all mentioned. Someone had been inside my home, had studied the contours of my life, and had decided to compose my death as though it were already history. A sound startled me then, faint but undeniable, the soft scrape of paper shifting across wood. I turned slowly, dread coursing through my veins. On the desk lay a single sheet I did not remember leaving there. My hand shook as I approached, unfolding it with the care one might give to a venomous serpent. It was a second obituary, shorter, more direct, just one line. Jonathan Hale. Deadline today. The penmanship was elegant, deliberate, and it told me everything I needed to know. Whoever had crafted this narrative was not finished. They intended to make it truth. I pressed my palm against the cool surface of the desk, struggling for calm. I was not a man unused to danger. Years of chasing corruption through the underbelly of the city had earned me enemies in both high offices and shadowed alleys. But never before had I faced an adversary so bold as to publish my end before it arrived. I tried to think rationally, to summon the instincts of a reporter trained to uncover lies. Who had access to the presses? Which editors bore grudges? Which sources had been silenced by my pen? Yet the list stretched long, and suspicion coiled around each name like smoke. As I paced the room, the clock struck 7. Its chime carried an ominous weight, as though each toll marked the dwindling hours of a life already measured. Somewhere beyond these walls, a hand guided this game, confident that the pieces would fall as foretold. And perhaps they would. For when I turned back to the window, fog pressing against the glass, I swore I saw a figure lingering across the street. Motionless, watching. My obituary had already been written. All that remained was for someone to see it fulfilled. The hours after that dreadful discovery unfolded like a fever dream. Every shadow seemed longer, every knock at the door an omen. My nerves, usually steady, frayed with each passing minute. I forced myself into action, for inaction would have been surrender. If someone had written my obituary, then someone within the world of print had sanctioned it. The presses were not careless machines. They followed the hand that guided them. And so I set my course toward the only place that could yield answers, the offices of the London Herald, where the death of Jonathan Hale had been declared before it occurred. The fog still lingered in the streets as I made my way across the city, though now it seemed more like a curtain concealing enemies than the ordinary gloom of London mornings. My senses sharpened, scanning alleys and rooftops, half expecting a bullet to pierce the veil at any moment. It was no idle fear. Whoever had written the obituary had studied my life in detail. They knew my habits, my weaknesses, and my schedule. My journey to Fleet Street might already have been anticipated. The newsroom was chaos as always, voices shouting over the clatter of typewriters, editors bent over proofs, ink-stained clerks rushing with stacks of paper. No one glanced twice at me as I entered. The living, it seemed, moved with little regard for the man who had been declared dead only hours earlier. I sought out Harold Venn, the managing editor, a sharp-eyed man with the temperament of a vulture. His office smelled of tobacco and stale ambition. When he looked up and saw me standing there, a flicker of something passed across his face. Shock or perhaps fear. But it was gone in an instant. "You're supposed to be dead, Hale," he muttered, tossing the paper on his desk as though it were a trivial mistake. "Caused a stir this morning." His words unsettled me. Not an apology, not an explanation, just irritation, as if my continued existence was an inconvenience. I demanded to know who had submitted the article, who had passed it through the presses. Venn lit another cigarette, smoke curling from his lips in lazy defiance. "No byline," he said. "Came through the night desk. Routine copy, checked against sources we trust. If it made the front page, it's because someone vouched for it." "And who might that someone be?" Venn shrugged, but his eyes betrayed unease. "One of the senior editors signed off. Or perhaps someone higher. These things slip through." The dismissal was too casual. I pressed harder, insisting on seeing the original manuscript. At last, with ill grace, he pulled a folder from his drawer and slid it across the desk. The sheet inside was the same article I had read in horror that morning, but scrawled in red pencil at the corner were 3 initials: M.L. My pulse quickened. I knew those letters. Margaret Llewellyn, a fellow journalist once renowned for her investigations into corruption at City Hall. She had been a colleague, even a friend, before vanishing from the newsroom nearly a year ago. Rumors had whispered of her dismissal, her descent into ruin, her growing hatred for those who had prospered while she fell, and now her initials marked the prophecy of my death. I left the Herald with the paper clutched in my pocket, the city spinning around me. Could Margaret have turned from ally to executioner? She knew my habits well enough, had walked these streets by my side often enough, and yet it felt too simple, too neat. The day stretched on in grim silence as I returned to my rooms. There I found further evidence of intrusion. A drawer left ajar, a photograph missing from its frame. The intruder had returned while I was away, emboldened, relentless. And on my desk lay yet another note, written in that same elegant hand as before. "Time is nearly up. You cannot escape the story already written." The words chilled me more than the fog ever could. I was being hunted not with blade or bullet, but with narrative itself. Someone had decided to craft my life's ending, to shape me into a character whose fate was already sealed. And with each passing hour, the deadline loomed closer. Night descended with oppressive weight. I bolted the doors, checked the revolver in my drawer, and sat with nerves taut as piano wire. Sleep was impossible. Each creak of the floorboard seemed a footstep, each whisper of wind against the window a hand reaching in. Sometime past midnight I heard it, the distinct rasp of metal on wood. Someone was working the lock. My breath caught in my throat as I extinguished the lamp and pressed myself into the shadows. The door eased open, and a silhouette entered, tall, deliberate, cloaked in darkness. The figure paused, as if listening, then moved toward my desk. Papers shifted. A drawer slid. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, yet I forced myself to remain still. At last, the intruder turned. For a moment, a sliver of moonlight revealed the sharp line of a jaw, the curve of a cheek. It was not Margaret. This was a man. Before I could move, he vanished as swiftly as he had come, the door closing behind him with chilling precision. When I dared to breathe again, I found on the desk a fresh slip of paper. Tomorrow, at dawn. The deadline had been set. The riverboat's dining hall was still heavy with unease the following morning. The Nile glistened with deceptive calm beyond the wide glass windows, yet among the passengers a storm brewed. Last night's discovery of Mr. Harrington's body had transformed the lavish cruise into a floating prison of suspicion. Detective Alistair Graves had hardly slept. His room had become a private command post, filled with sketches, notes, and the faint scent of cigar smoke. He summoned the passengers one by one for questioning, each interview tightening or loosening the noose around possible suspects. First was Evelyn Harrington. She appeared calm, dressed immaculately in morning black, but her eyes carried a dangerous clarity. "My husband had many enemies, detective," she said, voice like ice water. "But if you are looking to me for guilt, you waste your time. I tolerated Charles, but I did not kill him." Graves leaned forward. "Tolerated, Mrs. Harrington? You speak of your late husband as though he were an inconvenience." Her lips curved faintly. "He was. He controlled the money, the decisions, even the air I breathed. Freedom will not be an unpleasant thing, detective, but do not mistake relief for murder." Next was Robert Finch, the secretary. His hands shook as he clasped them on the table. "I served Mr. Harrington faithfully. Yes, there were disagreements about his business dealings, but I would never harm him. He was my employer, my livelihood." Graves watched his trembling carefully. "And yet, Mr. Finch, it is said you were the last to see him alive. That is quite the burden." Finch swallowed hard. I left him alive in his cabin. I swear it." Lady Margaret Sinclair floated in afterward like a queen on stage. She smiled as though the whole event were a troublesome play. "Detective, this is all dreadfully inconvenient. I booked this voyage for leisure, not interrogations. I knew Charles Harrington socially, nothing more. I found him intolerably dull, if I am honest." "And where were you last night, Lady Sinclair?" Graves asked. "In my cabin, naturally. Alone, alas, which means you will have to take me at my word." The detective said nothing, but his piercing gaze followed her out the door. Then came Yusuf the boatman. His weathered face betrayed little emotion. "I serve the river," he said plainly. "The Harrington man was drunk, angry. Men like him always fall eventually." "You knew him well?" Graves asked. "I know his type. They pay, they insult, they forget we exist. He made enemies without even noticing. But not me. I am only the boatman." His tone was convincing, but Graves noted how Yusuf's eyes flicked nervously whenever the name Evelyn was mentioned. Finally, Amal the maid appeared, small, quiet, barely more than a shadow. She kept her eyes lowered, hands clasped tightly. "Tell me, Amal," Graves said gently, softening his voice. "What did you see?" Her lips parted, but only silence emerged. She trembled, as though words themselves were forbidden. "She will not speak." Evelyn Harrington's voice cut in suddenly from the doorway. "Amal has served me faithfully. She knows nothing." Graves dismissed them both, but suspicion coiled in his gut. Silence was often louder than confession. That evening, Graves walked the deck alone. The Nile stretched endlessly under a blanket of stars. He replayed the testimonies in his mind. Evelyn's cold indifference, Finch's nervous stammering, Lady Sinclair's arrogance, Yusuf's evasions, Amal's silence. Each piece of the puzzle slipped in and out of place like water through his fingers. Then, a whisper. Not from the passengers, but from the shadows near the stern. Graves crept forward silently, his footsteps masked by the groan of the boat's engine. Two figures stood in hushed conversation. He recognized the voices instantly, Evelyn Harrington and Yusuf. "You said it would be clean," Evelyn hissed, her voice low and sharp. Now the detective pries like a vulture. Yusuf's reply was almost inaudible. "Patience. He suspects all of them. No one will know." Graves froze, heart pounding. Evelyn and the boatman? What strange alliance was this? He dared not move closer for fear of revealing himself, but the seed was planted. The widow was not so innocent, and the riverboat's silent servant was far from neutral. The next morning, a new storm erupted. Lady Sinclair claimed her necklace, an heirloom of priceless emeralds, had been stolen overnight. Her shrill accusations echoed through the halls. Graves observed quietly. A theft, after a murder. Coincidence rarely walked hand in hand with death. As he questioned the staff, his eyes fell on Amal again. She lingered near the corridor, wringing her hands, eyes darting nervously. Graves approached. "Amal," he whispered, "if you know something, you must speak. A man is dead, and now more lives may be in danger." Her lips trembled. Tears welled in her eyes. She opened her mouth, and a scream ripped through the air. Another body had been found. The scream tore through the narrow passageways of the riverboat like a blade through silk. Passengers rushed from their cabins, colliding in confusion and fear. Detective Alistair Graves forced his way through the throng, his tall figure cutting a path until he reached the source of the chaos. There, in the dim corridor near the dining saloon, lay Robert Finch. The secretary's lifeless eyes stared at the ceiling, his body twisted unnaturally as though he had been caught mid-flight. A dark bruise circled his throat, clear evidence of strangulation. 2 deaths in as many nights, Graves muttered, kneeling beside the corpse. Our murderer grows bold. The captain, pale and shaken, ordered the passengers back to their rooms, but whispers swirled like vultures. Lady Sinclair pressed a perfumed handkerchief to her nose. "This is ghastly. A floating house of death. You must end this, detective." Graves ignored her dramatics. His gaze lingered on Finch's open cabin door just feet away. Inside, papers were scattered across the desk, as if he had been searching for something in a hurry before death found him. Among the mess, Graves discovered a torn letter addressed to Charles Harrington. The words were jagged but clear. "You cannot continue this way. If the truth of Cairo comes out, we will all be ruined. I beg you, reconsider." The rest of the letter was gone. Graves tucked the fragment into his coat, his mind racing. Cairo. A secret buried in the desert, perhaps tied to Harrington's business empire. And now, Finch had died for it. Later that day, Graves assembled the surviving passengers in the Grand Saloon. The curtains were drawn, the air thick with heat and dread. He addressed them with the calm authority of a man accustomed to staring into the abyss. 2 men are dead, Charles Harrington and Robert Finch. This is no accident of fate. Someone among us has turned this voyage into a stage for murder. And make no mistake, I will find them. Evelyn Harrington sat poised, her black dress absorbing the lamplight. "Detective, you cannot expect us to remain calm when a killer stalks freely among us." "On the contrary," Graves said evenly, "panic is the murderer's ally. Clarity is mine." His eyes swept the room. Mr. Harrington's death was precise, calculated. Finch's murder was more desperate. Someone feared what he knew, or what he was about to reveal. Lady Sinclair scoffed. Then perhaps Finch was the killer, and someone silenced him in justice. Graves smiled faintly. Convenient, but murder rarely tidies itself so neatly. His gaze settled on Amal, standing silently behind Evelyn. The maid's hands twisted at her apron, her eyes downcast. Graves took a deliberate step toward her. "Amal," he said softly, "you tried to speak yesterday. What did you see?" The girl trembled. Evelyn's voice cut in sharply. "She saw nothing. She is a frightened servant, nothing more." Graves's eyes narrowed. "On the contrary, Mrs. Harrington, it is often those who are ignored who see the most." For the first time, Amal raised her eyes. They glistened with fear, but also with truth aching to break free. Her lips parted. Then Yusuf the boatman slammed his hand on the table. "Enough! Leave the girl. She has no voice in this." The sudden outburst drew every eye. Graves studied Yusuf carefully, recalling the whisper he had overheard last night between the boatman and Evelyn. The threads were tightening. That evening, Graves took to the deck once more. The Nile glowed with moonlight, silver on black. He lit a cigar, inhaled deeply, and replayed every word, every glance, Evelyn and Yusuf were linked. Finch had discovered something and it had cost him his life. Lady Sinclair's necklace theft was a distraction, or perhaps another crime born from opportunity. And Amal was the key. If only he could break her silence. He turned suddenly, sensing movement. There, in the shadows near the lifeboats, stood Amal. Her small frame shivered in the night breeze. "Detective," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I must tell you, before it is too late." Graves approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "Go on, child. Speak." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I saw Madame, with Yusuf. On the night Mr. Harrington died, they argued in his cabin. Yusuf left first. Then Madame came out. Mr. Harrington, he did not move again." Graves felt the weight of her words settle into place like the final piece of a puzzle. Evelyn and Yusuf. Lovers, co-conspirators, or merely bound by something darker? Before he could press her further, a splash echoed across the water. Both turned toward the sound. A rope swung loose from the side of the vessel. One of the lifeboats was gone. The alarm rang out. Passengers poured onto the deck in confusion. The captain shouted orders. Lady Sinclair screamed about pirates. But Graves' mind sharpened like a blade. Someone was escaping, and perhaps the murderer was among them. He leaned over the railing, staring into the moonlit Nile where ripples spread from the vanished lifeboat. The chase was no longer confined to the boat. The river itself had swallowed the trail. Graves turned to the captain. "Double the watch. No one sleeps tonight. We sail into Aswan at dawn, and there I will unravel this knot of lies." Yet as he looked at Evelyn Harrington's calm face in the lantern glow, and Yusuf's guarded stance by the rail, he knew one thing with certainty. The Nile had not yet claimed its final victim. The sun rose over Aswan in a blaze of crimson, staining the Nile as though the river itself remembered the blood spilled upon its waters. The cruise ship moored at the dock, its passengers weary, silent and watchful. Fear clung to them like a second skin. Detective Alistair Graves stood at the bow, his silhouette sharp against the morning light. He had spent the night without rest, pacing, piecing together fragments of truth and deception. Now the strands wove into a single, terrible tapestry. The captain gathered everyone in the saloon. The air was tense, heavy with expectation. Evelyn Harrington, immaculate even in morning black, sat with her hands folded elegantly. Yusuf leaned against the wall, his jaw set. Lady Sinclair clutched her pearls, eyes darting with suspicion. Amal lingered near the door, pale but resolved. Graves began slowly, his voice carrying authority. "Two murders have darkened this vessel, Charles Harrington and Robert Finch. At first glance they appear separate, but in truth they are bound by the same secret, a secret born in Cairo, stained by greed and betrayal." Gasps stirred, but he continued. Charles Harrington was not the dignified businessman many believed. He financed an illegal excavation in Cairo, smuggling antiquities from sacred tombs. Robert Finch knew this, and he tried to stop him. His letter was a plea, but also a threat. Harrington ignored it, and so the storm gathered. He turned sharply toward Evelyn. Her eyes remained cool, unflinching. "Mrs. Harrington," Graves said, "your husband's death was no accident of jealousy or chance. Amal saw you enter his cabin the night he died. You and Yusuf argued with him. You feared what Finch might expose, that your fortune was built on crime. You silenced your husband before he could unravel everything." Evelyn rose gracefully, her composure unbroken. "A bold claim, detective. But where is your proof?" Graves lifted the torn letter. Finch's warning addressed to Harrington. He spoke of Cairo, of ruin. And Finch himself was killed hours after searching his papers. The killer needed silence, your silence, Evelyn, and Yusuf was your accomplice. All eyes swung to Yusuf, his fists clenched, his breath ragged. "I did what she asked. I loved her. But it was her hand on Harrington's throat, not mine." The room erupted. Lady Sinclair shrieked. Amal sobbed. The captain cursed. Evelyn's mask of elegance finally cracked, her lips curling in disdain. "My husband was a parasite," she hissed. He used me as a pawn, paraded me as a jewel while he rotted in corruption. He would have destroyed us all. I ended it, yes. And Robert Finch. He would have dragged me into the mud. So I cut the rope. Her confession silenced the room. Only the river's murmur filled the void. Graves' voice was calm, almost pitying. And yet, Evelyn, in seeking freedom you chained yourself forever. Murder does not cleanse. It corrodes. She straightened, chin high, as though even in defeat she wore a crown. Better to be feared than forgotten. The captain signaled his men. Evelyn and Yusuf were led away, bound not by love now, but by justice. Hours later, the passengers disembarked. Lady Sinclair hurried into the arms of local authorities, already spinning tales for London society. Amal lingered at Graves's side, eyes haunted, but relieved. "Will she hang?" she whispered. Graves exhaled smoke from his cigar, watching the Nile flow, eternal and unbothered. "Perhaps, but the river has already judged her. She will never be free of it." He turned his gaze to the horizon, murder, deceit, greed, all swallowed by the endless Nile. But the echoes would linger in memory, whispers of blood upon the water. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the desert, Graves knew this was not the last time death would walk beside him. The world was wide and darkness endless. This, my dear friends, is the end of this story. Stay with us for the next one, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling audiobooks.